For my palette, I like a warm and cool of each of my colors. You'll notice that I didn't follow the arrangement that you see here in this photograph. I used the arrangement of those flowers just as a reference, just as a starting point. In my actual painting, I move the flowers apart. I do a lot of changes to it. So from those flowers, I created this studio painting that sold at that show. So I didn't have the painting to go by, but I did have a print of this painting here in my studio. So I used that print as the basis for the demonstration I did for my class. I had completed this not too long before that class, so it was all fresh in my mind. The flowers, I want to really emphasize how bright they are. All of those bright yellows and the light coming onto them. So what is it that we use to help lights feel more bright and brilliant? Darks, that's right, we want to get some darks in there. So the first thing we can start with is that background and get some dark in there. And the light is kind of, overall, is more of a diffused setting. It wasn't a cloudy, stormy day, but it was more just a gentle overcast. So the light is more diffused and is going to be a little bit cooler. So all of my shadows are going to be more on the warm side overall. And I'm taking and putting a lot more pressure out here in the background area when I lay the brush in, and then pulling up and away so that I lessen the pressure as it comes into the middle, because I want this middle to stay more of the brighter colors, and I'm going to have some of those dark colors touching the outside. So I'm not too worried about getting exact drawing or any of that, just kind of creating an overall feeling of where the petals are going to go right now. So on that one, I'm basically, even though it's a more diffused light, there's still generally a direction that the light is coming from. You're going to have one area that's going to be a little brighter than another. So on mine, I'm determining that the light's still coming from this direction, so I'm going to catch some of the tops of the petals here, and more of the full-on petal on this side of the flower. That makes sense? So keeping in our minds, our light source really can help us to create the three-dimensional or realistic quality of the subject, because we have a shadow side and a light side, and that can help us to know, so that we don't get lost in creating these. It'll help us to keep that going in the right direction all around the painting. Always maintain the direction of our light source.
Right, so in creating this little center area, I don't have to create it by coming in here and making a nice little round circle. I can also do it by painting around the edges of it, creating it that way as well. So if I want it to feel like the light is coming down and hitting the petals right around it, it's a little bit brighter light, I can come in and start pulling paint around it and create a center that way. Although that's a terrible looking center. Let's see here. What greens did I use? Boy, I'm probably going to tell you wrong, and we'll look at the video and say, that wasn't it. Okay, I used, this is that sap green deep that Utrecht makes. I really like that color. I believe I used some of that. And let's see. That's fun. Okay, my greens generally are made from a combination of things here. Let's see. So sap green deep can create this darker one, and then I added some alizarin crimson to it. Not that much alizarin crimson. And then maybe a little bit of white, just so it's not so dark. And some cad yellow medium. And a little bit more of that. And we can start to get, and all of this depends on how cool or warm I want that particular hue to be. Some of my darker greens I'll have a little bit warmer, some of them a little more cool. When I say warm and cool, I'm talking about color temperature. And then, of course, that's all relative. So this would be a little bit on the warmer side. See, that one right there. Compared to, if I just used more of the sap green deep itself is more on the cooler side, more on the blues. So you can see the difference. See, that's more on the yellow side, and that's more on the blue side of things. They're both darks compared to these, which are very bright. So then, same thing within bright areas, I can have a warm color temperature for the brights, and I can have cooler color temperature. So if I used more of the cad lemon in my greens and white, that can start cooling things down, because the cad lemon is cooler than the cad yellow medium in color temperature. And then when I add white, that really cools it down. And of course, if we add too much white, it becomes pasty and it loses all of its color. It loses all of its hue. So I don't generally do that. And then if I want, I can take that same green and start adding a little bit of some blue to it, maybe some of the manganese blue, and really start to cool down that. It's still bright, especially if I add more white to it. I can still have, so if I place this one next to that bright color, you can see one is more on the blue cooler side and the other is on the yellow, but they're both still bright. And so using a variety of these warm and cool greens throughout the piece makes it much more naturalistic. It's a much better feeling to it. So instead of getting into a pattern of just picking up a green off of the palette or something, I use a combination of things to manipulate the warm and cool of it and the dark and light value of it. So I'm constantly varying up the color temperature and the value as I go along. So a lot of what creates the structure in there are just little subtle shifts, changes, little subtle shadows and that sort of thing. You know, so hold the brush back towards the end rather than up here. You can get a lot nicer. Holding the brush back towards the end, you can get a lot nicer movement that way. Free to move movement. So if our strokes, if we can overcome the stiffness in our strokes, then it'll help to overcome some of the stiffness in the painting as well. So you can kind of see where we're going with this. Creating, this petal is going to be in shadow. Remember, our light source is coming from the right upper side. So that's going to make this petal feel like it's coming towards us, and these petals are curling up. So it's almost as if the flower is curling into itself a little bit. So we'll get these to feel like they're coming towards us. This one is pushing towards those. So this is going to be more in shadow. So if we think in those terms, that the light is coming from this direction, that means that if this petal is coming forward from the edge of that petal, we need a little shadow right there, so that it creates that extra illusion of three-dimensional quality. And if we want the petal to feel like it's farther away from the other petal rather than closer, then the shadow will be not as dark, and it'll be more diffused, because the light has farther to dissipate the shadow. Now, if we want to put a petal as if they're right next to each other, very close to each other, almost touching, then we get the shadow will be a little bit darker and not as diffused coming out. So this one would be closer in. So those are some of the things to think about when you're trying to decide what kind of structure you want the flower to have. And since we had an overcast day, the colors are going to be brighter, as on a nice, evenly diffused, kind of overcast lighting, like a north light. You can really see all the hue. The colors look more saturated. So we can get much more brilliant colors that way. But it also means that the light's going to be cooler, so the shadows are going to be warmer. Highlights will be cooler on a day like that. When I put in a shadow like that, I'm thinking, how tall do I want that little area to be? So the taller it is, the farther out the shadow is going to become, because the light will be coming down and pushing, you know, if the taller something is, the longer their shadow is, right? So if I want this to feel kind of small and very close to the surface of the flower, then I would barely indicate a shadow there. If I want it to feel like it's a little bit taller and more pronounced coming away from the flower, then I would increase accordingly the shadow, the size of the shadow. So in this case, I just want to barely hint that it's popping out, that it comes out away from the flower a bit. So what I'm doing with a lot of this is playing with paint texture as well. See, like that glob that I just let slide off the brush right there. I like that sort of thing. I love paint texture. I like globs of paint on there. But those are much more, once I lay something like that down, unless I don't like it, I don't play with it anymore either. That's what makes them work. So with a flower, you got to be real selective with that, not getting the big globs until you're close to the end of the flower, because it's a little bit more problematic to work with thick paint than it is thin paint. So we try to keep it thin as long as we can. And I got some green right there on my flower, which looks awesome. So, but once we start putting in some of these leaves and things, you can get some good thick paint going on right there and really play with it. And much of the success of those has to do with the pressure that we put with the brush. So laying something in and then pulling back with the pressure to let it just kind of drag out there. And then overlap helps to tie things together, like with that flower right there. Of course, if we want the flower to come out and forward more, we don't want to get carried away with overlap on that, because then it just pushes the flower into the dirt. So now I'm using some of these accents to help the viewer to get to the different parts of the painting, rather than getting stuck in one area. And that's what happens if it's too dark everywhere and we don't have any highlighted areas, then the eye doesn't know where to go. We're not leading the viewer really anywhere. So I'm taking now, I've had kind of a buildup of values from dark to medium to much brighter. And the brighter ones are the ones that are going to help, as long as I don't take away from the flowers themselves, the brighter spots of leaves are going to help pull the viewer into other areas of the painting that might otherwise be too obscure, and so obscure that nobody ever goes there. I want to have something there without getting it overly busy. The sharp edges, the highest contrast, those are the areas you want to reserve for those spots where you really want the viewer to focus. I have pretty high contrast right here. This flower, because of the color of it, because it's the complement to these, it really is pushing that into the viewer's attention. And because I have it more sharply defined than I have a lot of the petals on this flower here, it's also making it more pronounced, and it attracts the viewer's attention a little bit more than some of the others. Even though these flowers are such strong, warm color, this one almost stands out more than this one because so many of these petals on the edges are softened. So coming in, I can help offset that a bit by strengthening some of the petals here and maybe even putting a highlight on tips of them here and there. And then that will help that flower to start competing with the other one. Not in a way that we don't want them to compete, but so that they balance each other a little bit more. And we're not just bullseyed into this flower, because that's part of the situation here too, is that this flower now is almost centered. It's almost like a bullseye. So we're naturally going to hone in right to that piece. So I have to have things around, if I'm going to leave that flower in that spot, then I have to have something somewhere else that will draw us out from that eventually. So then the rest of it is just really subjective. This is where it comes down to the artist and how much you want to develop, how much detail you want to have, how strong do you want, how busy, how simple, all that. It really comes down to the feeling that you want in the piece. So what I usually like to do is sit around and look at the painting for a while and let it ruminate in my thinking a bit. Pay attention to see if anything jumps out at me after a few days. Actually, I like to put it kind of aside and not look at it at all for a bit and then come back to it with fresh eyes. That's really disconcerting when I send it out to a gallery and then recognize something that I should have done. So it's good to let it sit around for a little while in the studio and turn it towards the wall, put it out of sight somehow, bring in somebody else to look at it with fresh eyes that isn't a yes man or yes woman, somebody that'll let you know that just doesn't work right. My wife does that to me all the time, fortunately, and she's generally right. So having somebody around that isn't afraid to hurt your feelings and will give you just their gut reaction to the painting overall or to sections of it can be very helpful. All right, you guys have fun painting.